Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 05, Episode 09, where we dive into Andrew Heywood's political theory, an introduction and unravel the profound and often confusing concept of freedom. You've given us a fascinating mission today to navigate the intricate landscape of what it truly means to be free, how that intertwines with our willingness to tolerate, and the ever-evolving nature of identity. It's a deep dive that promises some surprising insights, I think, into fundamental political questions.
Indeed. And Heywood really emphasizes that while freedom is almost, universally revered in political writing, its actual meaning is deeply contested. It's not just some abstract idea floating around. It's a living ideal that shapes our societies, and it constantly challenges our assumptions.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Because as Heywood lays it out, understanding freedom is just the first step, right? Once we grapple with being free, we immediately hit the question of how much difference we allow. That's toleration. And then how our ideas about identity have reshaped, well, everything.
Exactly. So freedom first. The elusive meaning of freedom.
Right. So freedom, it feels so personal. But Heywood shows philosophers, economists, political theorists, they all come at it differently. How does Heywood start untangling that?
Well, he points out how the term itself shifts. Philosophers might zoom in on free will. Economists and sociologists, they talk about free agents making choices. But for political theorists, freedom is this crucial ethical ideal. The real challenge is giving it analytical clarity. And maybe the best way, Heywood suggests, is contrasting it with unfreedom, not just constraint.
Okay, and that gets us straight to that classic distinction, liberty versus license. Sounds simple, but Heywood says it's actually a huge source of controversy. What's the tension there?
Well, at its most basic, freedom is just doing what you want. But, almost nobody supports total freedom. R.H. Tawney, the historian, had that striking phrase, "The freedom of the pike is death to the minnows." It perfectly captures the dilemma, doesn't it?
It really does.
One group's freedom can mean destruction for another. So license isn't just too much freedom. It's freedom that's excessive, maybe oppressive or morally wrong in a way that harms others. Only anarchists really go for unlimited freedom. For everyone else, that line between liberty and license, well, it's an ideological battleground.
So it's not just about removing rules, but deciding which freedoms are actually good or okay. Can you give an example of how this plays out?
Absolutely. Think about economic freedom. You have libertarians like Robert Nozick or Milton Friedman. For them, maximum market choice is liberty. So an employer setting wages freely, that's fundamental freedom to them.
Right.
But someone from a socialist perspective might look at that exact same power and call it license. They'd argue it leads to worker exploitation, misery even. The key insight isn't just defining terms, it's seeing that freedom for the pike often means constraint for the minnow. That's where the political arguments really heat up.
This sounds like rights could be the boundary marker then. Freedom is acting within your rights. License is abusing others' rights. Does that simplify it, or?
It actually makes it more complex in some ways. First, rights often clash. Freedom can be a zero-sum game. An employer gets more freedom. Maybe the employee loses some. But even deeper, what counts as a right is up for debate. Modern liberal socialists, they uphold social rights, healthcare, education. But many on the new right see those purely as individual responsibilities, not rights the state should guarantee.
Which brings us to J.S. Mill and his harm principle. Big one. His idea was maximum liberty, just as long as you don't harm others. That feels solid.
Mill, yeah, hugely influential. And on liberty, he really wanted individuals to have total control over self-regarding actions, their own body, their own mind. He'd defend absolute freedom of thought, speech, even things like using dangerous drugs if they were purely self-regarding.
But the catch is harm, right?
Exactly. What does harm actually mean? If it's just direct physical harm, okay, that allows a lot. But if you broaden harm to include psychological distress, moral offense, economic disadvantage, well, then you could justify way more restrictions. It potentially blurs the very line Mill tried so hard to draw.
Okay, and how does equality fit into defining freedom?
Well, John Rawls, the American philosopher, suggested everyone's entitled to the most liberty possible as long as it's compatible with the same liberty for everyone else. Equal liberty. It sounds compelling. But applying it really depends on how you define freedom in the first place.
How so?
If freedom just means formal rights equality before the law, then making things equal is relatively straightforward on paper. But if freedom means having the actual capacity or opportunity to use those rights, well then modern liberals and social democrats argue you need things like wealth redistribution to make sure everyone can truly be free.
And that leads us straight into negative versus positive freedom. Two, negative versus positive freedom. Two sides of the coin, right? That famous distinction. Negative and positive freedom. Isaiah Berlin laid it out. But Heywood really digs into how these ideas become political battlegrounds. How does he break it down?
Berlin defined negative freedom as an area within which a man can act unobstructed by others. It's about non-interference. Think of Thomas Hobbes' freedom as the silence of the laws. It's about the absence of external blocks, especially from the state.
So less law, less government, more freedom.
That's the implication, yeah. It often aligns with advocating for a minimal state, laissez-faire capitalism, that sort of thing.
So if I'm free from interference, I make my own choices.
Yeah.
Like the free market idea, freedom of choice. Sounds like real liberty.
It does, and it really rests on a faith in human rationality. The assumption is leave people alone, they'll figure out their interests, learn from mistakes. Any kind of paternalism is seen as limiting liberty. But there's a big question, isn't there?
Which is?
If the choices available aren't reasonable, say a worker facing mass unemployment and only terrible jobs, is their choice really free?
Yeah.
Marxists would jump in here and call it wage slavery. Or even the freedom to starve. It highlights a major limitation if you ignore material conditions.
And that's where positive freedom comes in. It's not just what you're free from, but what you're free to do.
Precisely. For Berlin, one aspect of positive freedom is being one's own master, self-governance, asking, by whom am I governed? Not just, how much am I governed? That's like the liberty of the ancients. You're free if you participate in governing yourself. But the other key part is about an individual's capacity, their ability to realize their potential, to achieve fulfillment.
That capacity idea feels like it drives a lot of modern social policy.
It really does. Modern liberals, like T.H. Green back in the day, were reacting to the horrors of early industrial capitalism. They argued that things like poverty, unemployment, poor health, these social evils constrain freedom just as much as oppressive laws. Green defined freedom as the ability to make the most and best of themselves. And this positive view became a justification for the welfare state, empower people by freeing them from these social problems.
So the state actually helps you become more free. That feels like a total flip from the negative freedom view.
It's where they clash, absolutely. Modern liberals would say the goal is just helping individuals to help themselves. But critics, especially from the new right, argue that giving the state more power, even with good intentions, just creates new kinds of dependency, new forms of servitude. It robs people of control.
And the socialist take.
From a Marxist view, true freedom is about self-realization through work that isn't alienating. Marx would say someone like Robinson Crusoe, totally alone on his island.
Yeah. Loads of negative freedom, right?
Yeah.
No interference.
Exactly. But Marx would argue he's profoundly unfree because he's cut off from the social relationships and the creative, collaborative labor that truly makes us human.
And Heywood also warns about the extreme end of positive freedom. Ideas like being forced to be free. That sounds dangerous.
It really is. Rousseau, for instance, had this idea of the general will, the common good. Obeying it meant obeying your true self. So if someone refused to obey, they should be compelled, forced to be free. Essentially, someone else defines your freedom for you.
Right.
And that logic, taken to extremes, can justify authoritarianism, even fascism, where true freedom means submitting completely to a leader or the state. It's a stark warning.
The line between acceptance and intervention.
Okay, so moving from freedom, toleration. We tend to think it's just obviously good, but Heywood complicates it, distinguishing it from just being permissive. What's the key difference?
Yeah, toleration isn't just putting up with stuff you don't like. It's specific. It's a deliberate refusal to interfere based on some kind of moral reasoning, even when you could impose your views. It's not morally neutral. It usually implies you disapprove of the thing you're tolerating, but you choose to let it be.
So intolerance isn't just disagreeing.
Right. Intolerance is the active attempt to impose constraints, which then raises the big question.
Yeah.
What's genuinely intolerable? When does refusing to accept something become a moral necessity?
Heywood also talks about going beyond liberal toleration towards embracing difference more fully. How does that work?
Well, traditional toleration often carries that whiff of disapproval, right? You tolerate it, but you don't necessarily like it. The idea of difference pushes towards moral neutrality. It accepts, following thinkers like Isaiah Berlin again, that value conflicts are just part of human life. This can sometimes slide towards moral relativism, suggesting any freely chosen action is okay, or just seeing large parts of life as morally neutral ground. This post-liberal idea challenges the notion that liberal values should have a monopoly.
Okay, so why has toleration become such a big deal in Western thought? What's the historical argument for it?
It really came into its own during the Reformation after all those bloody religious wars. John Locke, in his letter concerning toleration, made a powerful case. He argued the state has no business meddling in the care of men's souls. Truth, he thought, would emerge from the free competition of ideas. Religion was personal faith, not something the government should enforce.
Private versus public.
Exactly. That idea of a private sphere where the state shouldn't interfere became fundamental to liberalism.
And J.S. Mill picked up that baton, tying toleration directly to individual liberty and self-development.
He did, passionately, in On Liberty. Mill saw toleration as crucial not just for individuals to grow, but for society to progress. He really feared the despotism of custom, especially in democracies where the majority could just crush minority views. He worried it would stifle individuality, critical thinking.
He had that famous line.
Yeah, that even if everyone else agreed on something, they have no more right to silence one dissenting person than that person would have to silence everyone else. For Mill, open argument, constantly testing ideas, was essential, because we can never be sure we have the final, absolute truth.
But there have to be limits, surely. Heywood raises that classic paradox. Should we tolerate the intolerant?
Ah, yes. That's the crunch point. Should groups that explicitly reject pluralism, who would shut down debate if they got power, be allowed to operate freely?
It's a real dilemma.
The argument for banning them says toleration has to be earned. Only those who are tolerant deserve tolerance themselves. Learn the lessons from history, like the rise of Hitler.
But the flip side.
The counter-argument is that being intolerant in the name of toleration can backfire. It can lead to witch hunts, think McCarthyism in the U.S., and it might even make these groups stronger by pushing them underground, giving them a martyr status. It really tests your faith in whether good ideas will win out in open debate. History suggests sometimes they don't, especially in crises.
So it forces societies to decide where their core values really lie.
Precisely. Toleration isn't infinite. Its toughest test is when it confronts those aiming to destroy it.
And this links directly to censorship debates.
For sure. The classic liberal view. What consenting adults read or watch is their business. No harm, no foul. But others, maybe neoconservatives, some feminist perspectives, argue that tolerating things like pornography is tolerating something wrong, maybe even harmful. They'd say it contributes to social decay or violence against women. It just highlights these deep disagreements about where harm begins and where individual choice ends, especially when harm is seen as subtle or unconscious. 4. Identity politics and the quest for recognition.
Okay, last big area, identity. Heywood uses this three-dimensional idea: personal, social, human. How does it help us?
That framework from Bhikkhu Parekh is really useful. Personal identity, we're all unique individuals. Social identity, we're shaped by our groups, ethnicity, religion, culture, gender, etc. And human identity, what we share as a species. Now, since the 70s or so, identity politics has really emerged, linking the personal tightly to the social. It emphasizes how we're all embedded in specific cultural contexts, and this has seriously reshaped how we think about freedom, connecting it now to ideas like respect, recognition, authenticity.
And this is where identity politics really breaks from older ways of thinking about tackling disadvantage. Heywood lays out three main approaches.
Yes, and the distinctions are important. First, there's the politics of rights. This is classic liberalism. It sees disadvantage mainly as legal or political exclusion. The solution: universal citizenship, formal equality, be difference blind.
Like fighting for the vote or against segregation.
Exactly. Think first-wave feminism, the anti-apartheid movement. It's about getting everyone the same basic rights.
Okay, second approach.
The politics of redistribution. This is largely socialist territory. It argues formal rights aren't enough if you're held back by social factors. Poverty, lack of education. Remember Tawny's line, the right to eat at the Ritz is meaningless if you cannot afford to pay the bill.
Right.
So the goal here is social equality, maybe wealth redistribution, creating a level playing field. Differences acknowledged, but mainly to fix unfair material outcomes.
And finally, the politics of recognition. This is identity politics proper.
Yeah. This approach says marginalization goes deeper. It's cultural. It operates through stereotypes, through messages that make people feel inferior. So it doesn't ignore difference. It emphasizes it. It calls for positive endorsement, celebration of cultural identity. Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, talked about recognition as this process of politico-cultural self-assertion. Think Black is beautiful or gay pride. These aren't just slogans. They're acts of defiance, of liberation from having your identity defined negatively by others.
It sounds powerful, but it has critics too, doesn't it? Seems like it could be divisive.
It certainly does. Amartya Sen, the economist, criticized what he called the solitaristic view, tying identity solely to one group. He argued it leads to a miniaturization of humanity, increases conflict, because people end up seeing the world only through that one lens.
And the fact that we all have multiple identities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gender, sexuality, culture, religion, class. They all intersect. So recognition politics can sometimes pull in contradictory directions. You might see tensions, say, between feminist goals and the practices of some patriarchal cultural groups.
Let's dig into gender and culture a bit more. For feminism, that debate, equality versus difference, has been huge.
Absolutely. Early feminism mostly focused on equality, seeing gender difference as the problem, as oppression. The goal was equal rights, equal power. This often involves separating biological sex from socially constructed gender. Simone de Beauvoir's famous line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," captures this perfectly, fighting biological determinism.
But then difference feminism emerged.
Right, arguing that maybe women shouldn't aim to be like men, but should actually celebrate distinct female values, characteristics, liberation through difference, not by erasing it.
And third wave feminism.
That shifted the focus again, looking at the differences among women, recognizing that the experience of, say, a white middle-class woman is very different from a low-income woman of color. Black feminism, for instance, really highlights how sexism and racism are interlinked systems. They create unique disadvantages that focusing just on gender or just on race can miss.
Okay, finally, multiculturalism. How has that shaped ideas about culture and identity?
Multiculturalism basically says culture is fundamental. It gives people a sense of rootedness, identity, pride, and crucially, it argues that this cultural diversity isn't necessarily a threat to political unity. You can have togetherness in difference, as Iris Marion Young put it.
Yeah.
A stable society with lots of cultures living side by side.
Different types, though, right?
Yes. You have liberal multiculturalism, which tends to say diversity is fine, but mostly in the private sphere. Keep public life based on shared liberal values. Then there's pluralist multiculturalism, which goes further. It might accept non-liberal or even anti-liberal values as legitimate within certain groups, emphasizing value, pluralism, and difference much more strongly, even in public life.
And then there's cosmopolitan multiculturalism. What's that?
That's Jeremy Waldron's idea. It celebrates cultural exchange, mixing, hybridity, a kind of pick-and-mix approach to culture. It sees culture as fluid, dynamic, not fixed. A multicultural society isn't a mosaic of separate tiles. It's more like a melting pot where things blend.
So identity isn't tied to just one culture.
Right. This view embraces multiple identity, or hybridity. Our individual identities are seen as a unique melange of different influences and commitments. Waldron even provocatively compared being immersed in just one culture to living in Disneyland, kind of artificial limited.
Interesting. But critics worry this weakens real cultural belonging.
Yeah, the worry is that if everything is fluid and mixed, you lose that strong sense of rootedness and recognition that specific cultural groups provide.
So it seems even the basic idea of culture in these debates isn't straightforward. Outro.
Wow, what a journey through these really tangled concepts. Freedom constantly debated, from non-interference to self-realization, toleration, not just acceptance, but a tricky moral choice with real limits, and identity moving from something seen as fixed to this dynamic mix of personal, social, cultural factors driving these powerful demands for recognition. It really underscores that these aren't just dusty ideas in a book, are they? They're alive. They shape our laws, our societies, our everyday experiences. The arguments we touched on are absolutely fundamental to understanding politics today and the challenges we face.
So what does this all mean for you listening? As you think about this deep dive, here's maybe a final thought to chew on. In a world that feels increasingly defined by diverse identities, by calls for recognition, how do we protect individual liberty without ending up tolerating ideas or groups that could actually undermine freedom and social harmony itself?
That tension, navigating between celebrating difference and maintaining some kind of shared framework for living together peacefully. That's the challenge. That's the ongoing conversation.
We really hope this deep dive has given you a richer understanding, maybe some new ways to think about these vital concepts. Until next time, keep digging deeper.